I'm Father Jim Martin. I am a Jesuit priest and editor of Outreach.Faith, the LGBTQ Catholic resource. This is the second of our Outspoken webinar series. We're very happy to have you with us. This is going to be taped. You obviously, you'll be seeing us live, but this will be taped and available later on. I want to thank Jay Sen, who is our technical advisor at Outreach. And we want to just launch right into the presentation tonight. We're very happy to have with us Father Bryan Massingale and also Ryan DeCorpo. I'm going to give them brief introductions, and then Ryan is going to mainly interview Father Massingale. I'll jump in from time to time, and then we'll take it from there. So Father Bryan Massingale is the James and Nancy Buckman Professor of Theological and Social Ethics, as well as the Senior Ethics Fellow in Fordham University's Center for Ethics Education. Prior to his appointment at Fordham, he was Professor of Theology at Marquette University. Professor Massingale is a leader in the field of theological ethics. He is a past convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, which is really the kind of overall umbrella group for Catholic theology in the United States. He is a member of the board of directors of the Society of Christian Ethics and serves on the editorial board of Theological Studies, one of the premier Catholic journals of theology. He also served on the editorial boards of the Journal of Moral Theology and the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics. He is a current member and past coordinator of the North American Regional Committee of the Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church Project. Dr. Massingale is the recipient of 4 honorary doctorates and has held the Bernard J. Hanley Chair at Santa Clara University. He's also the recipient of Marquette University's highest award for teaching excellence. And his biography goes on and on and on. He is also a valued contributor to Outreach.Faith. He's a very impressive and important voice in the LGBTQ Catholic world. I'm sure most of you know that already. He was also one of our keynote speakers last year at the Outreach 2022 LGBTQ Catholic Ministry Conference. He will be interviewed by my colleague, Ryan DeCorpo. Ryan DeCorpo is a recent graduate of Fordham University. He will soon graduate with his master's from the School of Journalism at Northeastern. And he is, maybe most importantly for our purposes tonight, he's the managing editor of Outreach, and a little bit of a surprise, he will be assuming that job full-time in May. We're very happy to have him with us tonight. And as I said, Ryan will interview Bryan. I'll pop in from time to time, and then we'll just see where it goes. So Ryan, take it away.
Jim, thank you for that introduction, and Bryan, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Ryan. It's good to be with you, and thank you, Jim. I'm looking forward to our conversation together.
In January, as you probably know, Cardinal Robert McElroy published an essay in America in which, among other things, he quoted from a Catholic Church document in England and Wales. And he said that the Church must boldly proclaim its authentic teaching, while at the same time offering a witness of radical inclusion and acceptance. In terms of LGBTQ Catholic ministry, what do the words radical inclusion mean to you? What might that look like in practice?
Okay. Well, thank you. I think that's the statement by Cardinal McElroy has indeed spurred a lot of conversation in the Catholic Church. And I think it's important we contextualize it, because I think when we hear the word inclusion, we can sometimes hear it with the words of a kind of a secular word lens or a secular ear, like we have to find a place for everybody. Whereas I think inclusion in the context of our faith really, for me, speaks more to the ministry and to the example of Jesus Christ. That when Jesus was on earth, one of the most powerful signs that and symbols of his ministry, one of his main actions, was his radically inclusive table fellowship. That Jesus ate with everyone, invited everyone to a common table. And that he had people around the table who would ordinarily by his society would be excluded from proper table fellowship, that self-respecting Jewish people wouldn't eat with tax collectors or sinners or with women. And Jesus invited them all to the table, and he did this in the name of the reign of God, that this was what the reign of God was to be like. And so when I hear the phrase radical inclusion, this is the way in which we kind of seek to operationalize what that message of Jesus means today. And I think especially for LGBTQ persons, our sexualities, our identities, our ways of loving have been stigmatized, even at times brutalized violently in society. And I think radical inclusion means that we welcome all to the table, especially those who have been harmed, who've been marginalized. And so for me, radical inclusion means that, for example, LGBTQ persons are welcomed to the Eucharistic table. That I think that means that we're welcomed in positions of leadership in the church. That means that we can teach and pass on the faith, both in CCD settings and also in Catholic school settings. I think all of these are ways in which we can operationalize radical inclusion. It means that we look at LGBTQ people not as walking sex acts, as I often say, but that we look upon ourselves as being disciples, that we are people who are spirit-filled, and that we have both the right and the responsibility to be an active part of the church and to help the church to pass on the faith of Jesus, which is ours. And so that's when I hear radical inclusion, I mean that we're really taking seriously Jesus's call to invite all to on the margins, as Pope Francis says, they're on the periphery, and invite them to the table and to do it in the name of God.
You mentioned not looking at people in terms of their sexual practices. And oftentimes when we talk about LGBTQ people, not just in the church, but also in larger society, there is an undue emphasis on their sexual practices instead of looking at them in a more holistic way. How can the church and members of the church move towards seeing LGBTQ people more as full human beings and not just as reduced to the sexual practices?
This is a great question. And here I think Pope Francis has shown us the way. Oftentimes we quote that very famous question that Pope Francis raised on his trip back in 2013, who am I to judge? But we have to look at the context of that saying when Pope Francis said it. He said, if someone is searching for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? In other words, Pope Francis from the beginning looked at LGBTQ persons not in terms of how they express themselves sexually, but he saw that people who are LGBTQ can search for the Lord and do search for the Lord and have goodwill and are people who can model faith. And I think that isn't what we need to do, is we need to look at the person. Pope Francis again said in another context, when God looks at an LGBTQ person, he sees the person. When I was a seminary professor, one of the things that Jim omitted in my biography is that before I got into Marquette University, I was a seminary professor for 13 years at St. Francis de Sales Seminary in Milwaukee, and I trained candidates for ordained ministry and lay ministry. And I always said in my moral theology classes, I always told the seminarians and I told the lay candidates, issues don't walk through the door, people do. And so you don't have homosexuality walking through the door. What you have are a mother or a father that's trying to grapple with the sexuality of their child. You don't have homosexuality walking through the door. You're having a young man or young woman who's grappling with the mystery of who they are and how they love. You don't find homosexuality walking through the door. you're finding a person who's more effeminate than they should be, or more masculine than they should be, and they're being bullied by their classmates or their fellow students. And I think that's the thing we need to kind of retrieve in our church, is the idea that issues don't walk through the door, people do. And can we see people as human beings who are struggling to discern the light of Christ and how Christ is leading them in their life? And then how we as a church are called to recognize people as bearing the light of Christ. I think that's what we need to kind of get to, the idea that, issues are not walking through the door, people do. And if we can do that, I think we'd be further ahead as a faith community.
The Catholic Church still has, at least in the Catechism, restriction on men who have quote unquote deep-seated homosexual inclinations joining the seminary. That is the language in which they use. How can the church be more inclusive, not only with its parishioners and inviting people to the Eucharistic table, but also in its seminaries?
Okay, that's a very good, that's a great question, Ryan. I need to make a small correction though. What you're quoting isn't in the Catechism, it's in a document from the Congregation for Catholic Education. And so in that document from the Catholic Education, I think it came out in 2005, and then was more ratified more recently, or repeated more recently. The deep-seated tendencies. One is that no one ever defined what you mean by deep-seated tendencies. I think that we need to back away from, especially when it comes to men in seminaries and in formation, to back away from the question of sexual orientation per se, and to ask the question, are they willing to grapple with their responsibility for living a celibate life, and can they then serve the people of God? I'm going to tell a story that when that document came out, I was on the staff of our seminary, and I was spiritual director for some young men who were in the seminary at the time, and they were very disturbed by this. And I went to one of the bishops who were sponsoring candidates at the seminary, and I told the bishop that he had to address this issue. I knew he was going to be meeting with the seminarians. And I said, I'm not going to tell you what to say, but I think you do need to say it, because there are men who are really confused and frankly scared about what this means for them. And the bishop looked at me and said, well, okay, I know you don't want to tell me what to say, but what would you tell me to say if you could? I said, well, now that you ask, I said, you should make 3 points. You should say that you know that there are gay men who are serving the church as priests and serving it honorably with integrity and fidelity. Second thing you should say to them is that you don't care what their sexual orientation is, as long as they're willing to take the responsibility of commitment to celibacy seriously. And thirdly, what you should tell them is that if no matter what their sexuality is, if they cannot serve gay men and lesbian women, and today I would include transgender people, with the compassion of Jesus Christ, then they do not have a vocation to the priesthood, because the priest is supposed to be a compassionate sign to the flock of Jesus. So then I left it at that. He said, thank you very much. And then the next week after he met with the seminarians, I was meeting with a seminarian in spiritual direction, and he said, you won't believe the bishop talked about that document, and he said he made 3 points. And I said, oh, really? Did he really now? And so I think that is really what we need to do. We need to, again, move beyond looking at people in terms of their orientation per se, as if their orientation makes this global statement about who they are, and to look at men and women as being ministers who are willing to serve the flock of Christ with compassion, and also to wrestle seriously with the obligations they assume in church leadership.
You are one of the few openly gay priests in the United States, and perhaps the only openly gay and Black priest in America. How has the church attitude towards gay clergy changed, for better or for worse, since you were ordained?
I can say this, that when I was first ordained, and by the way, I was ordained in 1983. So in May of this year is my 40th anniversary. So I've been doing this for a while. If you had told me in May of 1983 that I would be having this interview with you and I would be publicly known to be a gay priest, I would have laughed in your face. I would have thought that was impossible. And I think it would have been impossible, one, because I wasn't ready to make a statement like that. But two, I just didn't think that the church would ever be ready for a declaration like that. I can say now that in the year 2023, under the pontificate of Pope Francis, I think that this has become a much more viable possibility. I tell people that I'm living as an openly, publicly gay priest, celebrating Mass every weekend at the parish. People at the parish know and have no problems with that. Last May, I gave a major conference at an international assembly of Catholic religious educators in Rome. And I said, "Are you sure? I mean, do you know about my situation?" I said, "Oh, yes, we know, and we have no problem with that." But I would not say it's entirely, the church is entirely open to that reality. For example, there are dioceses where I've been told from reliable sources that I'm not allowed to speak in. I know on one occasion where a talk I was giving had to be removed from a seminary and relocated to a Catholic college because I was told the local bishop was afraid of the ideas I would put into seminarians' heads. That my being a witness of being an openly gay priest would somehow be a scandal to young men. I would say that the church's attitude is evolving and changing, but I would not be naive enough to think that it's not that the church is entirely comfortable with this reality. As I often tell friends, there are as you said, there are so few publicly gay priests that there really isn't a rule book or an owner's manual for how to do this. This is something that the church is learning, and that I think the clergy are learning how to do this publicly. But I think it's very important. I think it's very important that the church see that there are men who, in this case of Catholic priests, who are living lives of holiness and offering this model publicly for the church. The other thing I want to say is that I did not take the step of being public about my sexuality lightly, and I didn't do it to draw attention to me per se. I did it because the occasion was I was giving a talk, an address at the Assembly of the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics back in 2019. And just before I was to address the assembly, the delegates, and these were Catholic LGBTQ ministers and advocates from around the world who were gathered. They each presented an artifact from their country that described the situation of LGBTQ persons. And one of the delegates from the Congo presented a poster board, and it was covered with faces of the people who had been arrested and beaten and tortured and imprisoned and killed because of their sexuality. And a very sad, stunned silence settled over the room, and was only broken when one of the delegates from India spoke up and said, "I feel as if we are at the foot of the cross." And then I was to speak. And I felt so inadequate. What could I possibly say after that? But those delegates there, they invited me, they challenged me. They said, no, we need your words. We need your witness because of the relative freedom you have here in the United States. You can say things that we can't. We can take your words and use your words, but we can't speak them. We can't say them. And I took that as a vocational call. And I knew that I couldn't ask and invite them to return to doing the very dangerous work there many of them are doing in their countries if I wasn't willing to take a risk as well. And that was the context and the motivation for me identifying myself publicly as being a gay man who was a priest, a Black gay man who was a priest. And so I think another thing I would point out to my fellow clergy and to the listeners is that gay priests should not identify themselves as gay because this is going to serve some kind of, like, look at me kind of thing, look at who I am. I think we do it as a service to the church, as a vocation to the church, as a way for the church to recognize what has always been true, and that there have always been gay men who have served and are serving this church with fidelity and with honesty and with dedication as deacons, as priests, and as bishops. And that we have these models of holiness that are present to us. And if we could only be honest about that, I think that would also help us to deal more honestly with issues of sexuality, of same-sex sexuality, of transsexuality. I think that's the reason that we can offer the church a model that it's possible to be not only gay and Christian, but gay and Christian and mature and a spiritual leader.
Bryan, I'd like to ask a follow-up question, if I may.
Sure.
And also, I wanted to let people know that there will be time for questions towards the end, and you can use the chat function to write your questions there, and then either Ryan or I will read them out. Bryan, you really are a hero and a role model for so many because of your courage, not only because of your scholarship, but your courage, particularly in coming out and being so honest and transparent. One of the things I've always been curious about was the kind of, and you talked about your discernment with the global network of Rainbow Catholics. As I think about you, I always think that you're in a very complex situation because in a sense you have three kind of people, groups over you. You could say you have Fordham University and maybe former President Joe McShane and now Tanya Tetlow. You're a priest, if I'm correct, of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. And so you have that ordinary, as we say in the church, and then you're living in the Archdiocese of New York, so you would have Cardinal Dolan. So I'm just curious, how you sort of navigated that when you thought about your coming out, and without getting too personal, what kinds of feedback have you gotten, and how has it been with those kind of three constituencies that you have to deal with?
Wow, that's a really good question. Let's start with the easiest constituency. The easiest constituency would be Fordham University. Fordham University has been extremely supportive. My colleagues in the theology department have been absolutely wonderful with this. Sometimes at Fordham, I think the attitude is, well, is this a problem? I mean, because they just don't see what the problem would be. But on the other hand, with my students, since coming out, I think my students find me more intriguing because they know you're Black, you're gay, you're Catholic, you're a priest. How do you put it all together? And I said, well, it's a work in progress, but watch and see. And I think for them, it gives them a model, especially for young LGBTQ students, of how they can find a place in the church and they don't have to choose between their sexuality and their faith. And so I think coming out, in a sense, at Fordham has given me more of an opportunity for evangelization and for spiritual accompaniment than I would have had otherwise. In terms of my ordinary, I know that Archbishop Listecki isn't thrilled by this, but on the other hand, I'm still a priest in good standing with, faculties to celebrate the Eucharist. As I tell people, my sacraments are as valid as anyone else's. So I would say that I would say the bishops aren't, thrilled about this, but I don't think that, but they have not put any obstacle in the way of my ministry. I think what the bishops are doing is that, now I don't know this directly, this is something I'm reading into their minds, is that they're kind of watching and seeing, what does this look like? Because we have such few models for how to be an openly gay priest. And so I think at this point, they're not excited about it because it's new, it's strange in some ways for them. But I think at this point, it's kind of like we're in this kind of watching this new thing that the Lord is doing in the church. And I think they're trying to figure that out. But I also have to say that, the other constituency you didn't mention was the parish. I help out regularly at St. Charles Borromeo, one of the premier Black Catholic churches here in Harlem in New York City. And the Associated Press was doing a profile on me that ran a year ago. It was a year ago this February. And so they came to the church, they sent a photographer who was going to take pictures. And so I explained to the people, what the photographer was doing there and what they were doing, the story, a profile on me, wondering what their reaction was going to be. Their concern was not that there was going to be this profile about this Black gay priest. Their concern was making sure the photographer captured them in the right light. They were concerned about, what kind of pictures were going to run and, making sure that they were going to be highlighted. That's been their concern. And I would say that in the parish, it's really been a non-issue. And I would say it's also been a non-issue for many of my brother priests. There have been some priests who I've told people that I've lost some priest friends over this. People who feel as if they're seen as being too close to me, what would that say about them? But I would also say that many more priests have come up to me and said, thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for giving us a voice. So I would say that while this has not been an easy journey, I don't want to paint a rosy picture, but I would say that overall, there's been less negative fallout than I would have expected.
Well, and thank you for being such a model. Ryan, back to you.
Thank you, Jim. Bryan, you had mentioned that for your parishioners at St. Charles Borromeo, your sexuality and being public about it is really a non-issue. I'm wondering whether or not you see your parish as kind of a microcosm of American Catholics changing attitudes on homosexuality. Where do you think American Catholics writ large, while it's a diverse group, is on this topic?
That's a very good question. Survey after survey has shown that American Catholics are among them, as a body, as a group, are among the most accepting of the Christian denominations. And when it comes to issues of same-sex issues, in terms of either it's support for same-sex marriage or support for teachers in schools and things like that, we find that American Catholics tend to be far more accepting than other denominations, for example, more accepting than evangelical Catholics, I would say, definitely. So I would say I would see that American attitudes, Catholic attitudes, have really grown and changed. And I think there are a couple of reasons for it. One is that American Catholics tend not to be biblical fundamentalists. We tend not to be biblical literalists. And so I think that's one thing that works in the favor of the Catholic Church and the Catholic attitudes. The other is that the Catholic Church, deep in the Catholic DNA, is this conviction that reason and faith are not contradictory, that we believe that the best truths, the highest truths of our faith are deeply conformable or conforming with the best insights we gain through responsible exercise of human intelligence. And so I think that helps the Catholic Church and Catholics in general to be more open and receptive to what the human and social sciences are telling us about human sexuality. The other thing I think that helps us is the fundamental commitment that the Catholic Church makes to the dignity of the human person, of every human being as created in the image of God. This is the fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching. And I think that in some ways it's been deeply ingrained in our Catholic DNA that every human being has a fundamentally equal sacred human dignity. I think that fundamental Catholic principle helps Catholics to look upon gay and lesbian and transgendered persons as persons and to respect their humanity, even if they don't always understand their sexuality. As I always tell people, you don't need to understand in order to be compassionate. You don't need to understand in order to be respectful. And so even among Catholics who might have some reservations about the morality of sexual practices, there is still this fundamental respect for the human dignity which carries them through.
The pontificate of Pope Francis has been noted for shifting the tone towards LGBTQ Catholics worldwide. And Pope Francis has been lauded, for example, for saying, "Who am I to judge?" for that in-flight interview. He's been lauded for recently calling for the decriminalization of homosexuality worldwide. But he's also faced some criticism over a Vatican statement not too long ago about whether or not the church can bless same-sex couples, and the statement that, well, God cannot bless sin. So
Yes.
I was wondering how you view the current Pope's track record on this issue and how we can reconcile what at times seem like contradictory statements.
That's a great question too, Ryan. Someone asked me what grade would I give Pope Francis on his engagement with LGBTQ issues. And I said, I would give him a B+. And as a professor, most of my students don't want a B+. They're like, well, what did I do wrong? I said, no, B+ means above average. And the plus means that you're really well above average. And I think what Pope Francis has done is that he has gone farther and done more than any pope in Catholic history when it comes to recognizing the humanity of LGBTQ persons, and not doing it not only in his statements, the ones you've referenced, but also in terms of his own personal engagement. We forget that when he came to the United States, he included a visit with a former student and his spouse who were in a same-sex relationship. And so he meets with people who are in same-sex marriages, and he meets with them openly. He has been open in meeting with trans persons as well. The other thing that Pope Francis has done is that even though that statement about the church cannot bless sin in relationship to same-sex relationships, and that statement was painful for many, it was painful for me. The one thing he did not do was shut down contrary voices who spoke up with another opinion. So, for example, the bishops of Austria and Germany spoke up and said that we still want ways in which we can find a way to bless committed unions of same-sex couples. The bishop, one of the leading bishops of Luxembourg, the Bishops' Conference of Luxembourg, region Luxembourg or Belgium, I'm forgetting which one, came out with a ceremony of blessing same-sex relationships. So he's not quashed conversation. He's not stopped conversation. Cardinal Gregory of Washington, D.C. gave a notable address where he told a trans person that you are at the heart of the church. And so I think when we look at Pope Francis's record of LGBTQ issues, we have to look at his statements, but we also have to look at the atmosphere that he's created in the Catholic Church. One of the things that Pope Francis has said to the bishops when they gathered in synod is that he wanted them to speak with parrhesia. He wanted them to speak with the Greek word for courageous boldness. And under Pope Francis, no theologian has been disciplined or silenced for speaking out with courageous boldness, charting new paths for the Catholic Church's engagement with LGBTQ persons. That is not just a tone that Pope Francis has created, that's an atmosphere of welcome and open, honest discussion and dialogue. I think also when we think of Pope Francis, thinking about the welcome message that he wrote for Outreach 2021, which was, this, historic gathering of LGBTQ persons and advocates and ministers from across the spectrum of the Catholic Church. We had speakers from the Courage Apostolate, and we had speakers from Dignity USA. So the whole range of opinion, of Catholic opinion, and how Pope Francis wrote a message of welcome to this assembly. I think that what he's doing is that he's created the atmosphere for the kind of open discussion, which is a prerequisite for how the church can discern a path forward. We can't discern a path forward without open and honest discussion. And I think that's one of the major contributions that Pope Francis has made. So yes, I know for many LGBTQ persons, and myself included, I'll be honest, some of the more concrete statements, like the one you mentioned about the same-sex blessing, it still hurts because we're a community that's been hurt by the Catholic Church in the past. But I also think that we as LGBTQ persons need to look at the atmosphere that we now have in the Catholic Church, which has not existed up till now. And that gives me a great deal of hope, despite some of the temporary setbacks we sometimes experience.
You mentioned earlier that gay priests, whether openly gay or not, show the same fidelity to the church as their straight counterparts. I'm wondering what it means for LGBTQ Catholics to show fidelity to a church that at times has not shown that same fidelity to them.
That's a tough one, but I think it's a really important one. I think that we need to recognize that LGBTQ Catholics have some unique spiritual needs and some unique spiritual challenges, because we are members of a church who love a church that is still learning how to love us, to quote Jim. I would put it this way. We're part of a faith community that nurtures us deeply, but which also breaks our hearts. When I pray in a Catholic language. I find great comfort in the Eucharist. The church's sacraments, our sacramental symbols, our sacramental practice, they resonate deeply with me. I love our intellectual tradition. I love the fact that at our best, we believe that we have a faith that's not afraid of thinking. all of that is what it means to be Catholic. I love the fact I belong to a church that's a part of a universal worldwide community, that I rejoice in the fact that there are Catholics around the world who pray in a different language than I do and who use different music than I do, but yet we're all confessing one faith. All of that is deeply nourishing to me as a Catholic. And yet I also know that this church breaks my heart. It breaks my heart when I hear of people losing their jobs after teaching in a high school, sometimes for 20, 30 years in an exemplary way. And yet now, because they enter into a same-sex civil marriage, they're now fired, even though everybody knew that they were gay for years beforehand. It breaks my heart. Or it breaks my heart when I hear that there's a bishop that says I can no longer speak at this conference because I'm publicly known to be a gay man. And so I think as an LGBTQ Catholics, we need a ministry. We need ministries that can help us as we navigate that place of both pain and privilege of belonging to a faith that is deeply nourishing and comforting, and at the same time can cause us pain. And how then to navigate that place, which I believe that place of pain and yet of real comfort, that forms a cross. And I think that's the cross that we as LGBTQ Catholics bear. But we bear it because we believe that it's through the cross that new life happens. And I believe that LGBTQ Catholics, we are, I believe, the source of new life in the church precisely by our willingness to bear and to struggle with this cross of being a part of this faith community that is so deeply nourishing. I've cried at Catholic churches because of worship that's been so moving. And I've also cried at Catholic churches because of the rejection that's there. And I believe that both of those forms of tears form this cross that can be a source of new life. And so this is the reason why I think that the outreach ministry that you're providing, the ministry others provide, like Dignity and New Ways Ministry and others, that we're helping our fellow Catholics to find a way to carry that cross out of the conviction that our cross is an avenue of new life for the church. I know that that's not an easy message to say, but you know what? The cross has never been easy. Okay, I mean, like Catholics get over it. I mean, like Jesus never said this was going to be easy. I always tell people that. I would tell myself that when I, write in my journal, my frustrations or my anger, and then I'd remind myself that the cross is the price of integrity. And in this Lenten season, we remind ourselves that we say in the Stations of the Cross, I'm old enough to remember those devotions, we adore you, O Christ, and we bless you because by your holy cross, you have redeemed the world. And I really do believe that we as LGBTQ Catholics, in our willingness to carry this cross, we can help the church to grow in holiness and to become a more Catholic and universal faith community.
Also a beautiful sentiment during Lent. I want to thank Ryan and Bryan for this segment of the Outspoken webinar. We're going to turn now to comments and questions from our community here. And we have, it's a sign of a good webinar that we get more people as time goes along. So we may not be able to get to all the questions. Here's a comment first from Deanna Ford to everyone. Thank you for this. My son is gay and raised Catholic. This is extremely needed for youth raised in the church and feel guilt over their sexual orientation. because of society and the church's attitude towards LGBTQ people. Some of us would flock to your compassionate church, Bryan. So now here's a question, Bryan, from Marian Sciolino. Homosexuality is illegal in 68 countries, and in 10 countries there is capital punishment. 10 countries. What actions can be taken to help reverse these law and capital punishment?
That's a difficult question because every country has their own system of laws and their own culture that we need to engage in. I think that this is one of the things I think that we in America don't always fully appreciate the power of Pope Francis's call for decriminalization, because that's been our reality here in the United States. And we're like saying, well, so what, big deal? Around the world, this is still a very, very, very big deal. And when Pope Francis just recently returned from his trip to Africa, he went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and to South Sudan, he caused a public conversation about decriminalizing homosexuality in a way that never happened before and would not have happened without his intervention. And so I think one of the ways in which we can do this is by, one, continuing to raise the call for decriminalization and to do it in line for our respect for the fundamental human dignity of people. For example, we believe that criminals, even hardened criminals in the United States, have human rights because they're human beings. We don't have to defend people's behavior or agree with their behavior in order to defend their fundamental human rights. And I think that's the distinction that Pope Francis is trying to get the rest of the world to understand. The other thing we can do as Catholics is that when our fellow Catholics in these countries ask for our help, for example, by speaking out or by signing statements, that we do so. For example, in Uganda a few years ago, there were active measures to make homosexuality punishable by the death penalty. And a number of Catholic groups around the world, and I was privileged to be one of the leaders of this, signed open statements, condemning this and opposing this measure. I think that's very important for Catholics to continue to do so when we're asked by our brothers and sisters in these countries, to show that they're not alone and to raise our voices again in support of the fundamental human dignity of our fellow Catholics and our fellow human beings around the world.
Bryan, here's an interesting. I'm sorry, Bryan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and Bryan, if I remember correctly, I believe that Uganda eventually reversed that capital punishment dictate because of also international pressure that the country had faced.
Right. They basically it was called, and I'm quoting it, but this is what they called it the Kill the Gays bill. And because of the public outcry around the world, that measure was withdrawn from Parliament. It's still a criminal offense to be gay in Uganda, but the death penalty has been taken away. And it was taken away, I believe, in great measure because of the public outcry that was raised against it from around the world.
Here's a question for a moral theologian.
Oh dear.
This is from April Boone. It seems that the question of divorce and remarriage needs to be addressed as a precursor to LGBTQ inclusion and acceptance. What would you say to that, Bryan?
You would think it would be easier for the church to deal with divorce and remarried because it's a heterosexual issue. It'd be easier. And at one point, I thought that the Catholic Church would have to deal with the birth control issue before they dealt with the homosexual issue. But it turns out that that's not happening. It turns out that the engagement with the LGBTQ issue is happening in a faster rate than the divorce and remarried. And I'm not quite sure why that is, actually. I think it's because I really don't know. I would think that's because many people have, gay and lesbian relatives, but we have, divorced and remarried relatives as well. I will say this, that when we're seeing this from the Synod reports from around the world, both issues show up in almost every report that we get from these synodal gatherings in countries and now in the continental synods that are taking place. I think that both issues, the divorce and remarried issue and the issue of LGBTQ inclusion and equality, both are surfacing from the people of God around the world as being issues that are calling out for attention. And I single that out, that sometimes we hear that LGBTQ issues are concerned only for North America and Europe. And what we're finding is that it's not the case. That from document after document, from Korea, from South Africa, from Belgium, from Australia, from Korea, all around the world, these two issues of the divorce and remarried and LGBTQ inclusion and equality are surfacing around the world as issues that the people of God are asking our leadership to take another look at, and to say there has to be another approach which is faithful to the example of Jesus.
One of the surprises, I was in Rome a couple of months ago, and I met a young man who was working for the Synod. And for a number of reasons, he decided to go through all of the documents from the diocesan and bishops conference level, to see how many of them raised LGBTQ issues from around the world. And to your point, half of all the dioceses raised that issue. And it was from all over the world. And one of the reasons they put in the working document the quote from Lesotho was to remind people, as you were saying, Bryan, that it is not simply an American or even a Western issue. Here's a comment from Ruby Almeida. I was there for the GNRC assembly in Chicago and know that everyone was blown away by Bryan's talk, so thank you for that. And I know that Bryan did not use it as a publicity platform for coming out, but was moved by the Spirit in that moment. I'm most interested in his view about how, as a community, we seem to have been reduced, if not trapped, on the issues of our sexual proclivities. It is a deliberate separateness of us, a kind of exotification of who we are. Is it possible, useful, or viable to be just like others, to assimilate? Or do we need to hold on to our differences? There's a big question.
Thank you, Ruby. Good that you were with us. And yes, Ruby was there. In fact, Ruby was the delegate who broke the silence and who said that I feel as if we're at the foot of the cross. So Ruby was definitely there in that room. You know, I don't think that Catholic means calls for assimilation. I think that Catholic universality comes in by realizing it's in our differences that we can still also profess a common faith. That for so long, we thought that Catholic meant, for example, what the Mass. You could go around the world, anywhere around the world, and walk into a Catholic church, and the Mass would be exactly the same, in the same language, with the same gestures, etc. And now we understand that the Catholic faith can be proclaimed in a variety of tongues, with a variety of forms of music and dance and worship. And so I don't think we need, or we should, give up our differences. I think that the Spirit works through our diversity, as the preface in Pentecost says, that the Spirit works through our diversity, that Pentecost didn't cancel human differences. Pentecost embraced human differences and showed that our differences don't need to be a source of fear. Where I do think, though, that Ruby's talking about, and I'll speak here as a theologian, I think one of the things that the Catholic Church and the Christian Church needs to do is that we need to overcome the split between the body and the soul, which leads to a denigration of human sexuality because it's too associated with the body. And I think that we as Catholics, as a theologian, I think we need to really come to a powerful appreciation of the beauty of the incarnation, that God took on human flesh. God loves flesh. And that shouldn't be a radical statement. I mean, God loved human beings so much that God didn't appear to be one of us. God became one of us. And as I always tell people, this is a little inside baseball, but I'm a theologian, so I have to do this. I always say that the Docetism is the most stubborn and persistent human heresy. Docetism, for our listeners, is that belief that Jesus didn't really become human, that Jesus only appeared human, that he looked human, but underneath this tunic, he had this big G, this big God and no, Docetism is that belief that, there's something wrong with our human flesh and our human humanity. We need to become, I would say, more orthodox. We need to become more committed to the reality of the incarnation and see our human flesh with its drives, with its passions, with its desires, that these are avenues for the divine and that these are sacred. If we can do that, then I think that our sexual teaching will evolve accordingly, not becoming liberal, but becoming more orthodox, becoming more informed by our commitment to the incarnation.
I think we have time for one more question. We unfortunately can't get to them all. And then I'm going to thank Ryan, and then I'm going to thank Bryan, and then I'm going to ask Bryan to lead us in a closing prayer. So this is a wonderful closing question and a tough one. Gina asks or says, I love the church, but because of all that is being said here tonight, I feel pulled towards the Episcopal Church, in particular the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. I wonder if I might one day join the cathedral because they are so radically welcoming to all. Any advice to keep me in my Catholic church?
That's a tough one because I live in New York, and the Cathedral of St. John the Divine is my next door neighbor. I literally look out the window of my apartment and I see St. John the Divine. Let me first thank her for that question, because I think that she's raising a question that many Catholic LGBTQ persons have. And that is, sometimes we think, wouldn't it be easier for me to simply join another church where I wouldn't have to fight so hard? And I understand that, and I hear that. And I know that there are many Catholics who put the church in a timeout corner for their own emotional or spiritual sanity. And I would never fault people who, for their own emotional sanity and spiritual health, say that, it's just become too toxic for me. I just can't do this anymore. And I need to join another faith communion. And so I would never blame people for making that. But I would encourage her not to do that because, as I said, if you believe that this church is yours and this faith is yours, and there's something here about Catholicism that speaks to your heart and your spirit, don't be pushed out because some of our other believers can't yet grasp your beauty and your dignity and worth. What keeps me in the church is that I have to sometimes remind myself that the church is not only the hierarchy. The church is not only the bishops. Vatican II taught us that the church is the people of God. The church is all of us. This webinar is church. This community is church. The people who will watch this webinar later are church. And I would encourage her to remember that there are people like her who are walking with her, who grieve with her, who long with her, who pray with her, and are willing to help her carry her cross of pain with her as well. That's why I would encourage her to stay. That she's not staying alone. We're not doing this alone. We're doing this together. We're doing this in community. That's why I would encourage her to stay. And if she needs to leave for time, I understand that. Love her anyway. I would love to welcome her back. But just make her realize that, please, whoever you are, you're not alone. You are a part of the church. We are part of the church. Our baptism is just as valid as anyone else's. We are equally redeemed by Christ. We are equally loved by God. That's what keeps me in the church, and that's why I hope and pray that she stays in the church as well.
Amen. Thank you so much. That's a beautiful answer. I want to thank, first of all, Ryan DeCorpo, Managing Editor of Outreach, soon to become full-time Managing Editor of Outreach, for moderating this discussion, and our guest, Father Bryan Massingale, Professor of Theology at Fordham University. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank Jay Sen, who is our technical advisor at Outreach. I want to thank everyone who joined us. Wonderful crowd tonight and community. You can follow us on outreach.faith. You can join us at the Outreach Conference this summer in June. You can read more about Bryan and articles by Bryan on Outreach, including his wonderful talk last year. So thank you very much. We ask you to pray for us at Outreach, support us financially if you can. And Bryan, would you like to lead us in a closing prayer?
Sure, thank you. Let's pray. Gracious God, as we prepare to celebrate the dying and rising of your Son, we ask you to be with us in our dyings and our risings. Help us to see that through the cross that we carry, new life comes into the world. Walk with us, be with us, help us to carry whatever cross is present in our lives. And may your strength help us to continue to be witnesses of your radically inclusive love, that our witness can be a call for the church, a catalyst for the church to continue to grow into being that wonderful sign of the reign of God that you called your church to be. Bless us in our trials, bless us in our joys, bless us as we walk together in faith. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all. God bless you all. And we will see you at the next Outspoken.